Well, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. I think there's a few more people coming in from the coffee break, but in the interests of finishing on time or even a little bit early so you can get out and enjoy the sights of Birmingham in the sunshine, we should probably make a start. As I said earlier, it's a great pleasure to be able to welcome Dr. Matt Menard and Dr. Alik Farber from Boston in the US. They're the co-chief investigators of the BEST-CLI. We've spent a lot of time together speaking about these trials over the last goodness knows how many years. We've become very good friends, and I'm so delighted that they've been able to find time in their hectic schedule to be with us here today. And they're going to share with you their experiences of BEST-CLI, and I'm sure it'll be really fascinating. And Dr. Farber, I think you're going to start. Thank you very much.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Andrew, for your kind invitation. In some way, I feel like I'm living in a parallel universe to what's happening here. We just had an investigators meeting in Washington, D.C. in April. It was a fantastic event. A lot of people have attended. It was exciting. And I'm seeing the same sort of excitement here. So it's really fantastic. A couple things we're going to do. We're going to give you a little bit of our background, our perspective, talk about BEST-CLI, talk about hemodynamics, talk a little bit about the SVS Wifi staging system, and then talk about some of the obstacles that we have in BEST-CLI, which is very similar to BASIL, and how we've been negotiating through them. So in 2018, it's an exciting time. We live in a tremendous age of technological advances. Endovascular technology is blossoming, and at least in the United States, there's all sorts of endovascular technology being really coming to us almost on a monthly basis. New devices, drug elution, recanalization of CTOs, pedal artery vascularization, all sorts of things, and that's great. But there's some issues we need to think about as well. There's a tremendous amount of variation, both in amputation rates and revascularization rates in patients with CLI. This is a map of the United States, and tremendous variability you can see here, and this is actually across the world as well. There's also tremendous variability in intensity of vascular care that's being administered in the United States. This is from a study that looked at the number of interventions performed before an amputation, sort of as a marker of intensity of vascular care across the United States. There's tremendous variability that's out there. There's also the fact that among some groups of patients, among those with diabetes, amputation rates are actually increasing. There is a declining expertise in lower extremity bypass. It turns out that 30% of fellows graduating fellowship in the United States have done less than 10 infrainguinal bypasses, which is staggering. And so, of course, there's these three monkeys. Industry doesn't really want to see what's going on for their reasons. All of us are guilty for our own biases, and of course the professional societies also have some role in this. In addition, there's not a lot of evidence to support the choice of revascularization strategy. And we've taken a very deep dive into this, just as I'm sure Andrew has. This is one recent meta-analysis, comparative effectiveness meta-analysis of all the endovascular versus surgical intervascularization procedures performed for critical limb ischemia, and the conclusion is that there is not enough high-quality evidence to guide clinical decision-making, which is exactly why we're doing all of this. There's tremendous variability in how CLI is treated. So I'll give you an example of what's happening in the United States. So this is a graph that we show around a lot. You may not have seen this. So on the x-axis are VQI centers. These are centers that are participating in the Vascular Quality Initiative. It's an initiative it's actually happening, I think, in Europe as well now, but certainly this reflects both the United States and Canada. And at the time the slide was made, there were 380 centers. And then on the y-axis are percent of patients with CLI treated with bypass versus endovascular therapy. And as you can see, there's tremendous variability. There's some centers that do very little bypass, and there's some centers that do very little endovascular, and there's everything in between. And having traveled around North America, this is exactly what we see. There are some centers that are endo-shy, there's some centers that are incredibly endo-aggressive, and everything in between. And there's actually evidence that suggests that, in fact, endovascular therapy can actually harm patients. In this study from the NIS, National Inpatient Sample, more than 500,000 procedures, it turns out that patients who had endovascular interventions for CLI actually had a higher amputation rate. And we also know that results of bypass after failed endovascular therapy is inferior. This is something that comes to us from BASIL-1 and also from the Vascular Quality Initiative. So we know all of that. And we also know that in these frail patients, sometimes they only get one shot. And so delay does matter. It does matter what treatment to offer them first. Even though we have the ability to offer both types of treatment, it actually does matter, and it really is important to do the right thing. And so our journey began about 10 years ago, when Matt and I sort of had this idea that we wanted to answer this question because we were seeing patients with CLI in our hospitals, and our decision as to how to intervene on those patients really was not based on science. It was based on a lot of other things, availability of the operating room, personal schedule, and that sort of thing. And so we thought that this was really an important thing, and we talked to people. In fact, people agreed. It was to our benefit that our previous president earmarked $1 billion for cost-effectiveness research. The Society for Vascular Surgery in 2010 prioritized critical limb ischemia within the top 3 unmet challenges. And then we submitted our application to the National Institutes of Health in June of 2010, and the grant was approved in October of 2013. And so we are running the BEST-CLI trial, which again is very similar to BASIL and BASIL-1 and BASIL-2. I'm here representing Dr. Menard, who you're going to hear from in a few minutes, but also we have a third principal investigator, Kenny Rosenfield, who is an interventional cardiologist. We have a separate data coordinating center, New England Research Institute is the name. We have a cost-effectiveness core at the Brigham Women's Hospital, and of course the sponsor is the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, and this is sort of our organizational structure. Just please note the red box, that's our Data Safety Monitoring Board that oversees the trial, and they're meeting in 2 weeks. And so we're preparing for that meeting with some trepidation, as we do for these meetings, but they've been very supportive of the trial. Now, BEST is an NIH-funded, prospective, randomized, multi-center, multi-specialty, pragmatic, open-label superiority trial. The aim is to enroll 2,100 patients at 160 clinical sites. The goal is to assess clinical outcomes, quality of life, cost, and really value in patients who are candidates for both vascular surgery and endovascular therapy. BEST is well-powered, it's well-designed. It is a real-world trial in that all bypass conduits are allowed, all endovascular therapies are allowed in the trial. It's really a conglomeration of 2 parallel trials. Cohort 1, patients who have single segment great saphenous vein, basically the best possible conduit for bypass. Those patients are randomized against endovascular therapy. Cohort 2 are those patients, it's a smaller cohort, those patients who do not have single segment saphenous bypass. So if they are randomized to open surgery, any conduit can be used, including prosthetic. We're stratifying by presentation, rest pain, or tissue loss, and anatomy, whether or not there's tibial disease involvement. We have novel endpoints. We're actually convinced the NIH to use male-free survival, which is a novel endpoint, which we think is a more robust endpoint than amputation-free survival, and comparing revascularization strategies that includes death, amputation, and major reintervention. We're looking at hemodynamic success, clinical success. We plan a comprehensive quality and economic analysis. And we have brought all the specialties to the table. In the United States, much less so in Canada, but in the United States, cardiologists, radiologists, and vascular surgeons, and vascular medicine specialists all do interventions. And depending on where you are, those ratios vary. But it was pretty clear to us when we submitted for this grant that we had to bring everybody to the table, everybody who's treating CLI. And so we've done that. And it's been challenging to do that across centers. And in some centers, we've been widely successful. At some centers, not so much. But the point is that all specialties have been invited and are participating in this trial. And we're excited about that. So a little bit about our enrollment. This is a map of our sites. We have 130 active sites in North America now. We've ventured out of North America. We've activated 3 sites in New Zealand and 1 site in Finland, and we have another couple of sites in Europe that are in the process of being onboarded. We have almost 1,000 investigators participating in this trial. The majority of vascular surgeons, because it turns out that vascular surgeons are the ones who mostly treat critical limb ischemia. But we've done everything possible to engage radiologists and cardiologists. And 2/3 of our sites are multidisciplinary. This is our enrollment curve for sites. So onboarding of sites, and as you see, we're continuing going up. We have closed some sites that haven't performed. The first patient was randomized in August of 2014, and as of this morning, actually yesterday, we're excited to say that we have 1,367 subjects randomized. And we know how difficult it is to randomize these patients. So as I've been hearing the conversations this morning, I completely empathize with everything that's been said, and we can maybe talk more about the specifics later. I want to give you a little bit of a sense of who's in the trial. Every time we have a DSMB meeting, there is an open report that's prepared that gives people a sense of sort of who's in the trial, and I'd like to share that with you just to give you a sense of who. So basically, as of the last DSMB freeze, there were 1,266 patients, so 80% of them were in cohort 1, which is again the cohort with the good vein, which is similar to what was predicted. If you look at our strata, the majority of patients in BEST are those who have tissue loss and tibial disease. 56% are in that stratum. And then we're a little bit, we've struggled to get women into the trial. It's interesting, similar amounts of women are approached, but in the end, through the process, there are less women that are entering into the trial, and it turns out that this is not new. It's been reported elsewhere, but we're not where we need to be with women, a little bit lower, 29%. Where we need to be in terms of the racial profile, the amount of Hispanic patients, that's an important thing in the United States. The median age is 67, 16% of bilateral CLI. And then if you look at these characteristics, you'd recognize that these are similar to what you would expect to see in a cohort of patients with critical limb ischemia. Our compliance, we've had a little bit of an issue with loss to follow-up recently, and we're trying to fix that. You know, these trials are as you all know, difficult to run, and we're doing everything possible to retain patients. Our crossover rates have been low, we're excited about that. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about sort of CLI and diagnosing CLI and what does that all means. You know, it turns out that there's been some issues with standardization of CLI and definition of CLI. I think you all know this. You know, if you look at the literature, you know, people have used the word chronic ischemia, chronic critical limb ischemia, CLI, severe limb ischemia, broadly applied. Which term is correct? Which term is best? I know that the recently developed global CLI guidelines that are going to be published, I believe, this spring, this fall.
September.
Okay, September. You know, they all agreed that chronic limb-threatening ischemia is the word that's going to be used. And in the same way, the definitions of CLI have really have changed over the years as well, very different. So when Fontaine described it in 1954, it was existence of rest pain and tissue loss. There were no hemodynamics that were part of the definition. When Bell and Rutherford and others came together and published their new guideline definition in 1982. There was a hemodynamic profile attached to the definition, but diabetics were excluded. And then, of course, in BASIL and in BASIL-2, you're using severe limb ischemia as the definition. The PARC consensus, which is a recent multidisciplinary consensus, again, is much more prescriptive about hemodynamics. Now, of course, there are multiple ways we can assess hemodynamic status of the lower extremity, from ABIs to toe pressures and that sort of thing. And it turns out that the PARC folks really came up with this definition, and something that we're using often in the United States, where it's not just the symptoms, because sometimes it's hard to know if a patient has ischemic rest pain. They may have pain in the foot. It's very hard to know that somebody has ischemic rest pain unless you actually get hemodynamic proof of that. The same thing for tissue loss. And so you can use these criteria, and there are other criteria that can be used: ABL less than 0.4, monophasic Doppler waveforms, flattened PVRs. And so in our definition for the BEST trial, we have this definition here. So for ischemic rest pain, we want to make sure that the patients have an ankle systolic pressure of less than 50, or toe pressure less than 30, or TCPA2 less than 30, and so forth. And the threshold to enter into the trial is much, for hemodynamics, is much higher for ischemic rest pain. So for ankle pressure of less than 70, and the patient can enter with tissue loss, but they need to have a pressure less than 50 to enter with rest pain, because we want to make sure that the patients with rest pain truly have ischemic rest pain. And so we have all this described in our case report forms, so it makes it easier for people to fill these out. Now, of course, if you look at tissue loss, and this is from the Task 2 document, it turns out that tissue loss, often in the foot, it's related to arterial disease, but not necessarily. I mean, it can be related to venous disease, diabetic neuropathy, and we believe that hemodynamic assessment is actually very important in light of that, because we have to confirm that, in fact, the patient has CLI. Now, many times we suspect CLI. In fact, most times we kind of suspect it ahead of time from history and physical, but often we confirm it, at least in our practice, with hemodynamics, to make sure that, in fact, are dealing with CLI and not something that looks like CLI. It's also a good way to assess the degree of ischemia and to follow up treatment. And of course, hemodynamics is used in staging as well. Like, as I said, you can suspect CLI without confirmatory studies. But with clinical judgment alone, theoretically, a patient with a neuropathic ulcer and no ankle pulses would get invasive treatment, would be offered angiography and possible revascularization. I've seen patients, a number of patients in my career, who don't have palpable pulses, but they in fact have near normal flow on their hemodynamic profile. And those patients who have mild to moderate ischemia sometimes are better off with wound therapy alone and not revascularization. So we believe that aggressive posture, sort of making the diagnosis of CLI without hemodynamics, really would expose more patients to intervention and actually would increase the cost of care. And even with gangrene, you can have gangrene superficial caused by, let's say, thermal injury and no significant ischemia as well. Now, the risk of amputation and the response to revascularization in patients with CLI depends on multiple factors. And these are the factors, and Dr. Menard will talk a little more about this, but there's degree of ischemia, extent of depth and tissue loss. The foot on the left and the foot on the right have different profiles, and the presence of extent of infection. And it turns out that these scenarios overlap in any given patient. So there's been a lot of work on trying to establish a staging system to help us really identify the patients in their status, to predict their risk for amputation and response to vascularization. But it's very difficult to have a reliable staging system if you're not assessing the circulation. In fact, the SVS Wifi staging system includes assessment of hemodynamics. So hemodynamics does allow us to accurately assess the degree of ischemia. And I believe that without hemodynamics, we're a little bit in the dark. And this is why in Task 2, which was published more than 10 years now, but I think still is very relevant. I just want to quote this from that document. The diagnosis of CLI should be confirmed by non-invasive studies. All patients with a foot ulcer should have an objective assessment of the vascular status. A pulse examination alone is an inadequate vascular examination in these patients. Any diabetic with foot ulcer should have further evaluation in the vascular laboratory. And of course, we agree with that, and we try to do that in the BEST trial. So I'll finish here and ask Matt to come up and give his portion of the talk.